Pearl and Rose Quartz's relationship is in many ways very beautiful and in many ways very sad and disquieting, especially from Pearl's perspective. Pearl is the character whose side of the relationship we see the most, and it is her who is both more sympathetic and more misguided. This is, in many ways, a strong relationship. It is a relationship of commitment, of connection, of devotion. However, there are also a lot of serious problems with it that the show touches in interesting ways, and many things that the show does not necessarily directly address that become much more, I don't want to say problematic since I don't like that word, it's too general, but more worth examining critically in light of what we learn about Rose Quartz / Pink Diamond later. Pearl's side of the relationship is that of absolute commitment and devotion. She will do everything for Rose Quartz. She is wholly committed to the cause of Rose Quartz. She treats everything Rose Quartz did or owned with a kind of religious, almost reverence. It is a relationship that has many qualities. It is one of a follower and a leader. It is one that is obviously romantic, certainly very romantic on Pearl's part. She's filled with all this longing for her, as explored in many of her musings, such as the hauntingly plaintive song, It's Over, Isn't It? Still my favorite song from this show, and the centerpiece of my favorite episode of this show, wherein Pearl laments how she lost, in her view, Rose Quartz to Greg, of all people, and she just has to accept that. She has to understand her beloved's choice and try to support it. Try to care about Steven. Her care about Steven is a direct result of her absolute obsession for Rose Quartz. Now, to a certain extent, this is understandable. It's a normal thing for someone to care about your kid, not necessarily because the kid's special, but because they care about you. That's a normal friend or even ex or whatever complicated relationship dynamic you have thing to do. It's even more emphasized because Steven literally is Rose in a lot of weird and complicated ways. But it is a bit unhealthy and not necessarily the best for Steven, because while it is good that Pearl cares about him, and she does, he has to deal with the shadow of her very strong feelings, very passionate, very love-struck, very embittered in some ways, especially at the end, toward a person he never knew, that being his mother. That is a difficult situation for Steven, and he plays it with as much maturity and thoughtfulness as one could possibly expect from a kid. Pearl's relationship with Rose Quartz is very idealized in her mind. She very much has this ideal of Rose Quartz that is more important than Rose Quartz herself. She preserves that ideal. She fights for that ideal at all cost. It's a very beautiful ideal for Pearl. And there is nothing wrong with defending an ideal. There is nothing wrong with deeply caring for an ideal. The problem comes when that ideal becomes connected a bit, only a bit, to the actual person. There starts to develop a kind of disconnect, a kind of severance of the ideal and the actual person. Freud talks about this quite a bit in terms of the image of the beloved. That is constructed by the lover. The lover's identity is very much intertwined in many ways with this conceptualized image of the beloved. It is innately linked to the lover's sense of themselves. Lacan, a disciple of Freud in many ways, takes this a bit further. He talks about the specific manifestation of the object of love as being simply a part, a component, a specific example of this larger idealized thing, the das Ding, the thing that can never be had, even though it is beloved, even though it is yearned for. The ideal of the person very much swallows up the person themselves. That's Lacan's perspective. And going back to Freud, this can be deeply damaging to the person. Freud has this wonderful essay called Mourning and Melancholia. Melancholia being an old-fashioned term for what we would call depression. Mourning, he's saying, is a kind of temporary kind of depression, where our identity is so deeply connected through this passionate love bond, eros, with the beloved object, the person of our affections, and that when this person dies or is in any way no longer there for us to connect with, there's a severance, and it creates this deep sense of loss, this deep sense of alienation. It directly affects the self, because the self is inevitably bound up in these relationships with others. This is normal. I want to be clear. This is entirely normal on a basic level. The problem is when the self becomes so attached to the object of love that when the object is lost, when the target is lost, it doesn't just go somewhere else. That love isn't redirected toward another person or another object. It doesn't just disappear. Instead, it falls back on the self. The shadow of the loss falls upon the ego. The ego, not in the sense of egotistical, but the ego in the sense of the conscious, central, controlling part of the psyche. When the self is so firmly identified with what it knows it cannot have, what it knows is beyond its grasp, whether it's because someone dies, or because one just can't have them, or because they're lost to one in some way or another, and one can't move on, basically. One has that deep identification with them, and that identification continues, even though the object of that love is lost. That loss is deeply felt in the individual self. The self thus feels loss. It thus feels this profound sense of disorientation because it is connected to something that is no longer there. And that is, for Freud, what melancholia, or what we would call depression, is. Now, one can object to Freud for whatever reason, but I think in the case of Pearl, that is a good way to look at what has happened to her. She has this obsessive, over-idealized connection with Rose Quartz that is in many ways beautiful and noble. She does fight very well for Rose Quartz and fight for a better world. But she remains so deeply connected, so deeply dependent on this object of love. Her entire sense of self-worth is entirely linked up to it, so that when that is lost, when Rose Quartz is no more, that is a deep sense of self-loss for Pearl, and she never recovers from that easily. The entire course of the show for Pearl, her entire arc, as it were, is her trying to move forward with her life, is her trying to finally move through that process of mourning and grief and be able to operate and move in the world like a quote-unquote normal individual and form new connections. See Stephen, for instance, as Stephen instead of simply an extension of his mother. This relationship, I will say, takes on an even different context when one knows that Rose Quartz is Pink Diamond. Pearl was her Pearl, there to serve her. That one revelation instantly changes a lot about Pearl's character, and a lot of my misgivings about that revelation have always related back to Pearl. I'm not saying that this wasn't planned out or that it is a complete shock. I am saying that it fundamentally transforms Pearl from a character who made the choice to rebel against the existing structures of authority and has this deep, loving, obsessive connection with Pink Diamond because she was the one who freed her from that system, to simply being a follower, not being a rebel. Rose Quartz, Pink Diamond, was the rebel. Pearl simply followed her and became a rebel alongside her. Pearl did not, it is revealed, really rebel much against any kind of social order. She is still very much in that same connection to Rose Quartz that pearls are to their diamonds, that position of complete obedience and submission. That, combined with the romantic aspect of their relationship, especially for Pearl, she very much deeply loves Pink Diamond, Rose Quartz, in a romantic way, leads to a questionable dynamic, because it's not equal. It is fundamentally an unequal connection between one person who cares about Pearl, who likes Pearl, who respects Pearl, but does not form her sense of self around Pearl, and Pearl herself, who very much has a sense of self that is so innately and utterly tied to Rose Quartz, toward receiving the approval and the care of Rose Quartz, that when Rose Quartz is gone, she is completely shattered and does not really have a sense of self to fall back upon outside of that relationship. It's uncomfortable, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's complicated, and it's meant to be, is what I would say. There is a lot of genuine care and genuine passion and genuine consideration for Pink Diamond, for Rose Quartz in Pearl. And this devotion does lead her to do a lot of good things, a lot of moral and just things for the world. And even for someone like Stephen. And yet it also causes her to make questionable choices. A very clear early example of that is her training with Connie. Both sides of that relationship, Pearl's relationship with Rose Quartz, are very clear there. Both the good and the bad. It's good that she feels this desire to protect Rose Quartz, and it is good that she wants to pass on those skills to Connie. And yet, the sheer devotedness of her connection, that sheer obsession, can go too far. Connie should not want to die for Stephen. She should not be prepared to die for Stephen. But Pearl is for Rose Quartz. Now, one could say it's wrong that Pearl teaches her this because Pearl can regenerate and Connie, of course, can't. But that's not, and that's true, but that's not really the major issue here. The issue is this one-sided, absolutist devotion, this selfless sacrifice taken to an extreme. That's not healthy for any relationship. That's not healthy for, say, Connie and Stephen for reasons significantly other than the fact that Connie can't regenerate if she's killed, if she's deeply hurt in that way. It's deeply troubled on this existential psychological level. Pearl needs to find a sense of herself apart from that which Rose Quartz gives to her. She needs to have an idea of who she, specifically, personally, Pearl, is. And she goes steps in that path along the course of the show, and these are moments where I'm the proudest of her, where she has accomplished the most. I do wish the show had spent a little more time focusing on that element of her character, especially in the aftermath of the Pink Diamond twist. But I still think Pearl is a very fascinating character. In many ways, she is extremely noble, extremely forthright. She is a picture of complete selfless devotion. But she is also a picture of wherein that selfless devotion can go too far and lead to a complete negation of any individual self-identity. Rose Quartz, Pink Diamond, is caring, but at her worst, she can be kind of capricious. She simply follows her own passions and feelings wherever they lead her. Pearl is the exact opposite. Her devotion is absolute and unwavering. That in many ways is quite beautiful, especially when it's in the service of improving the lives of other people in the world, but it can also be quite destructive and absolutist. And both sides are worth thinking about. So thank you all for watching. If you liked yourself today, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Donate to my Patreon if you can and you want to see more videos like this one before anyone else. Keep watching Steven Universe. It's still a great, fascinating show. It deserves a lot of analysis and introspection. Adios, comrades.